I want to start off this lecture by going back to something I mentioned right at the beginning of lecture 1. There I said that what bound all the social sciences together was the idea of social order, how it's achieved, how it's maintained, and why it sometimes breaks down. One of the mechanisms that produces some semblance of order in our day-to-day lives is that human societies have cultures that, amongst many other things, consist of norms. Norms are non-consequentialist rules of behavior, which means they are non-instrumental in their form. They do not say, in order to achieve Y, do X. For example, to cut the loaf nicely, use a bread knife. They simply say things like, do X. For example, women and children first. Or, in situation Z, X is the right thing to do. When you meet the Queen, you should bow or curtsy. We can immediately make a distinction between those norms that have the weight of law behind them and those that are merely social conventions that generate expectations about how people should behave. Infractions of legal norms are crimes of interest to the agencies of law enforcement, subject to process by the courts, leading to punishment that is enforced by the power of the state. Infractions of social norms are not, in most circumstances, of interest to the state. They may, however, lead to surprise, puzzlement, distress, opprobrium, laughter, ostracism, shame, and all the other things that people do to deal with situations where people act in ways that are difficult to understand or seem inappropriate. I'm starting with this distinction because the sociology of crime and deviance is, rather obviously, Janus-faced. On the one hand, we have people and work concerned in one way or another with issues to do with the etiology, control, and punishment of criminality. On the other hand, we have people and work concerned with a much broader conception of rule breaking and rule breakers that takes in far more than the merely criminal. Though this categorization is not watertight, the former tends to be the intellectual domain of people who style themselves as criminologists, and the latter the domain of people who see themselves as sociologists of deviance. In the past, this was regarded as an important distinction, and there was often little love lost between these two tribes. When I was an undergraduate at the London School of Economics, the Department of Sociology offered two distinct optional courses, one called Criminology, taught by Terence Morris, and the other called the Sociology of Deviance, taught by Paul Rock and David Downs. The clienteles for these courses tended to be non-overlapping. Criminology attracted serving police officers, intending social workers, probation officers, solicitors, and people who wanted to understand why people became criminals and what should be done with them when they were caught to stop them offending again. The sociology of deviance tended to attract student radicals and people who believed that the most important issues were not to do with people who broke the rules, but with the consequences of the way societies made the rules in the first place, and how they classified some people and some activities as deviant or non-conforming. Thus, while the criminologists were interested in the careers of burglars, the sociologists of deviance were as likely to be interested in the careers of, well, transvestites, transsexuals, homosexuals, beatniks, poolroom hustlers, pornographers, prostitutes, jazz musicians, the mentally ill, juvenile gang members, and myriads of other groups that in some way or another transgressed against the norms of straight society. Of course, in some ways, all this now looks a bit passé. Societal norms have changed so much in the last 50 years that what was once thought to be exotically transgressive, though not criminal, is now simply regarded as a normal part of the choices available to anyone living in a modern, tolerant, liberal society, and scarcely worth comment. It may also be that eventually people recovered from the worst excesses of 1960s psychobabble and regained a sense of realism. I think I witnessed a turning point around 1982 when I heard Paul Rock say rather wistfully in his Sociology of Deviance seminar, perhaps out of frustration, that we really shouldn't entirely forget that criminals do actually hurt people, and that the mentally ill are not just experiencing new windows onto reality, but are suffering terribly, and perhaps we have some obligation to help them get better. Let's now think a little bit more about the sociological use of the term norm. Some norms are just arbitrary solutions to common coordination problems. It doesn't matter whether we drive on the left or the right, as long as we all do the same thing. There is really no mystery about their generation. It might as well be a toss of a coin. But once we've decided what the norm in our society is, infractions of it will become matters of interest to the legal authorities. Outrage at infractions of coordination norms have less to do with the fact that the rules have been broken, but more to do with the predictable consequences of breaking them. Other people are, for instance, put at danger. Social norms are a bit different. Every society has them, but often it's difficult to identify what they are until someone brings attention to them by breaking them. Jon Elster has a nice example. Say you arrive late for an event with a limited capacity and a first-come, first-served entrance policy. You find a very long queue, and it's obvious that if you obey the convention of joining the end of it, you will not get in. What then stops you going up to the first person in the queue and offering them a sum of money sufficient to induce them to take your place at the end of the queue? If you were to do this, nobody would be worse off, and one person, you, would be better off. But intuition tells us that this is just not the sort of thing that people should do. Now, articulating what the norm actually is may be quite difficult. Presumably it's something like naked expressions of economic power and advantage in queuing settings are distasteful and to be avoided. Driving to the event in your Lamborghini, for instance, doesn't attract the feeling that you have done something wrong, though it may of course generate feelings of envy and resentment for quite other reasons. The more we think about it, the more we see that significant parts of our lives are regulated by social norms. The clothes we wear, the polite way to eat our food, fork never in the right hand in the UK, whether to kiss cheeks or shake hands when meeting friends and relations, how close we should stand to someone when having a conversation, what kinds of topics are acceptable in casual conversation with strangers, how to respond to an inquiry about your health. Not too bad in the UK. A detailed blow-by-blow account of your last medical appointment in Germany. How the bill should be split when dining out with friends. How drinks should be bought when a group goes to the pub. What you do at a bus stop. Form an orderly line or mill around and Devil take the hindmost when the bus arrives. Though some of these social norms may be tinged with moral connotations, many are not. It's a social norm in the UK to hold the knife in your right hand and the fork in your left. Breaking that rule is not generally regarded as an indication of bad moral character, merely as an indicator that you don't quite know how to behave, or perhaps come from somewhere where the rules are different. It's difficult to imagine what a general theory of social norms would look like. Many norms may just be, to all intents and purposes, arbitrary in their origins, the results of known but utterly contingent events. Like standing up for the Hallelujah Chorus, because, allegedly, in 1743, George II stood up and another social norm kicked in to do with the correct behaviour when your monarch stands. Other norms are the subject of equally ingenious just-so stories, and we have no idea, actually, whether they are true. But they all raise the same questions. Why do we conform to social norms? Why do some people break them? And why do they frequently fall into abeyance? The answer to the why do we conform to them question typically consists of two parts. The first emphasises the role of more or less severe sanctions. If our society or our community imposes some cost on us for breaking the rules, then we have an incentive to conform. And some social conventions are spontaneously policed. At the milder end of the spectrum, people may be teased on account of a social faux pas. Queue jumping normally attracts at least some pointed comments, and at the harsher end, people may be shunned, or worse, by their family and their wider community for choosing, for instance, the wrong marriage partner. One thing to note: sanctioning norm breaking is actually costly for the sanctioner. They have to do something. So we immediately encounter the problem of, well, why do they bother? It would always be better to let someone else do it and not bear the cost yourself. But of course, if everyone thinks like that, then no sanctioning will ever take place, unless, of course, there are second-order norms about punishing the breakers of first-order norms, and so on, in an infinite regress. The second reason for conforming to norms has a more psychological character. Our cultures lead us to internalize feelings of guilt and shame about either breaking the rules, or being caught breaking the rules, or even being thought to be the sort of person that would break the rules. I might refrain from doing some things even when there's no possible way that anyone can punish me. And of course, saving face and avoiding shame is a very important part of the way some cultures work. But of course, despite the existence of sanctions and the internalization of psychological dispositions, the fact of the matter is that people do break social conventions, frequently deny that social conventions should apply to them, and challenge people to sanction them if they dare. Social norms also change and mutate. In the 16th century, the revenge ethic was still alive and well in Western Europe. Hamlet is a play about a sensitive young man struggling with the conflict between Renaissance enlightenment and his duty to right a wrong done against his honour. Duelling emerged in aristocratic society during the Renaissance and probably had the consequence of regularising the defence of honour, channeling it away from the stab in the back down a dark alley, and restraining the development, of course, of multi-generational blood feuds. though it would be a stretch to claim that this was actually an act of deliberate invention. It survived into the 18th and 19th century despite official disapproval and attempts by governments to stamp it out. But eventually there came a day when pistols at dawn was not the solution, and gentlemen, for it was men, did not feel that they had to give satisfaction or face a lifetime of disgrace. Nevertheless, the notion of honour lingers on in some communities, and criminal gangs do exact punishment from individuals they classify as showing insufficient respect. In the first of these cases, notions of shame, particularly patriarchal ideas of family shame, seem to be implicated. In the second, it seems obvious that an important motive is actually the instrumental protection of a scarce good, reputation. If you are in the drug distribution industry, the quickest way to be driven out of business is to acquire a reputation of being a softie. Eye for an eye retaliation, and then probably some more, may be the only way to trade in relative peace. I want to move on now and talk about sociological theories of crime and deviance. One of the first things that strikes you about sociological theories of crime and deviance are that many of them actually have little to do with explaining variation in the incidence of crime and deviance, and could perhaps be more accurately viewed as, well, ways of seeing or perspectives, rather than stricto sensu theories in the sense of explanations. Take, for instance, Emile Durkheim. His rather ingenious take on crime is to observe that a certain amount of it might actually be good for society rather than bad, though presumably not so good for the victims who are left to console themselves with the thought that they have endured the sacrifice for the common good. Modern societies, thought Durkheim, suffered not from a surfeit of regulation, but a dearth. Their curse is not normative conformity, but anomic individualism. However, criminal rule-breaking apparently serves a useful function because, assuming the criminals are caught and punished, the judicial process and the punishment become occasions for a ritual-like shock and awe reaffirmation of what the rules actually are, and thus strengthen adherence to them. This opens up the possibility of endless speculation about what the optimal level of criminality might be. It's hard to take this line of thought terribly seriously, or to see what of any use might come of it. It is in fact a classic piece of functional explanation. A phenomena or institution, in this case crime, is accounted for in terms of the effects it has on the whole it is part of, and it is thus somewhat surreptitiously suggested that it exists because of this role or function. Neat as it sounds, it's ultimately feeble, even as a perspective. There is practically no institution or phenomena that can't, with sufficient cunning, be said to have some benefit for someone, perhaps as yet undiscovered. In reality, this is all just a rather empty form of words. If the modern lack of normative constraint on individuals is part of Durkheim's story, the American sociologist Robert Merton pulls a variation on the theme. But now the trick is reversed, and the vision is of a society that is too well integrated, in the sense that the goals that people have in life, let's say a nice house, a car, a well-paying job, the respect of one's neighbours, and so forth, are widely, if not entirely universally shared. Everywhere you look, these are held out to be the goals that everyone should aspire to. However, the means to achieve them are not evenly shared out. Many are called, but few are chosen. Merton sets out a typology of possible responses, and these responses define a set of social roles that have associated with them the outline of a behavioural script. If you accept the culturally prescribed goals and the institutionally available means to get them, then you are a conformist. You work hard, play by the rules, and seek the things you're told you should want. However, there are 4 distinct deviant adaptations that define different roles. You might, for instance, accept the goals, but reject or have no access to the conventional means. This kind of orientation would actually encompass a number of quite different social roles, only one of which would be the criminal deviant. It could equally well describe the situation of an entrepreneur, an inventor, or an artist. You might reject the goals, but accept the means. Merton describes this as ritualism. One might imagine a time server in an organisation who knows that they are going no further and rationalises it by saying, well, I never wanted to get to the top in the first place. Or the city trader who hates his job, despises his colleagues, and lives for the day when he's made his millions and can retire and write his novel. You might reject both goals and means, what Merton terms retreatism. This is suggestive of something like joining a religious order or selling up, giving away your possessions and going to live in a teepee on the Pembrokeshire coast, perhaps raising goats and growing curly-kale. Finally, there is rebellion. This entails not only rejection of goals and means, but their replacement with something else, not just for yourself, but for everybody. This seems like the job description for the role of a radical or revolutionary. Though this typology is quite interesting and illustrates the point that social norms have a role in generating social roles, it is less than clear what it buys us. Making a set of theoretical pigeonholes is only useful if it then enables us to do some useful work. Simply labelling things may lead to the illusion of revelation, but it's unlikely to explain very much. On the other hand, it is suggestive of some observations about criminality that are commonly made. It's often said that for some, criminality is essentially a job, and carrying out a burglary is the equivalent of another day at the office. Some choose legitimate work, others become armed robbers, but the goal is the same: the means to live in the style you think you deserve. This kind of remark is often made about the motivation of adolescent street gangs involved in drug distribution. If you want a BMW by the age of 18, you can either dream of it while you work in a call centre, or you can engage in the sort of illicit and risky activities that, if you survive in the game, may mean that you can achieve that goal. It certainly seems to some people that to get what everyone appears to want will not be possible through the normal channels. The next theoretical move is in some ways rather predictable. Merton is saying that the criminal deviant wants what everyone wants, but can't get it in a legitimate way. But maybe they don't. Perhaps they have quite different goals, or even no goals at all. People may simply drift into crime, almost by chance, and after a while find it difficult to extricate themselves. They may find some forms of deviance and risk-taking actually pleasurable. They may just be bored and have a strong desire to make something happen or be someone. In 2011, between the 6th and the 11th of August, there was serious rioting, looting and arson in London and other cities. The precipitating event seems to have been the shooting of Mark Dugan by the Metropolitan Police 2 days earlier. In the aftermath of the events, there was a lot of soul-searching about the causes. Amongst those that were mentioned were all the usual suspects: poor relations with the police, social exclusion, family breakdown, government cuts, unemployment and poverty, gang culture, criminal opportunism, moral decay and failure of the penal system. No doubt all of these may have had something to do with it, but exactly what is nigh on impossible to say. All of these factors create possibilities, but whether they turn into events is another matter. One factor that was also mentioned at the time was rioting for fun. For me at least, this rang a bell. I went to a school where rioting, though not an everyday occurrence, did occasionally happen from time to time. There was usually a standard sequence of events. Firstly, a rumour circulated that something had happened to one of the pupils. Normally it was that lads from another school close by were going to come over in the lunch break and avenge some perceived wrong or other. Throughout the morning, the story would build up. Weapons had been seen, someone had allegedly been attacked the previous day, and so on. The next phase depended on the local hardnuts. There was a small group of pupils who didn't really care whether they were expelled today or tomorrow or next week. How things evolved depended on whether they and their lieutenants fancied some fun today. However, they were not complete fools. Obviously, things would be a lot more fun if more people were involved. So the crucial thing was whether enough of the shifting penumbra of hangers-on, the next level down from the lieutenants, threw caution to the wind and joined in. If they did, something would kick off. If not, it wouldn't. Because of all the rumours that had been circulating, a large proportion of the school would be on the playing fields, expectedly waiting to see what would happen. The crunch moment came when the bell to return to class after the lunch hour rang. If the hardcore, their lieutenants and the surrounding penumbra, defied it and stayed out on the playing fields, then there was a good chance that the majority of the timid would join in. There is, after all, safety in numbers. Teachers can usually control disorder involving a small number of pupils, but if 500 pupils defy them, then they have a serious problem. Once a tipping point is reached, the costs of any one individual pupil joining in sink dramatically. Suddenly, many pupils realised that control had broken down, and the chances of them being punished were essentially negligible. As long as you remained part of the crowd, you were safe, and the event was fun and exciting, and certainly beat doing double maths on a hot June afternoon. In addition, once the majority joined in, you did not want to be the one who conformed and meekly went back to the classroom. If you did that, it would be remembered, and you would lose face among your peers. So, what to learn from this? One thing is that big events, even quite trivial events, don't necessarily have one single cause. They don't even necessarily have deep, profound causes. Sometimes they have trivial or obvious causes. Turning the world upside down for an hour or two can seem like a lot of fun, if you can get away with it. We might as well ask why people don't do it more often. Which is more or less exactly how the sociologist Travis Hershey puts it in formulating his social control theory of criminality. The question should not be, why do they do it, but why don't we all do it? The answer he gives is that what matters is the strength of social bonding, and to quote him, elements of social bonding include attachment to families, commitment to social norms and institutions, school, employment, involvement in activities, and the belief that these things are important. This would seem to be a theory or description of rather wide empirical application. For instance, Frank Parkin's theory of working-class conservatism is very similar in spirit, i.e., in a capitalist society, we should expect by default high levels of support for conservative parties from all sections of society, unless people have attachments to people, institutions, and organizations that lead them to deviate towards an alternative vision of society. Of course, the explanatory power is a bit illusory unless you can explain why some people are strongly socially bonded and others aren't. There might also, of course, be the small problem that some get strongly socially bonded to groups whose activities are in fact criminal. At this point, you might feel like asking me, so what, then, should a good explanation look like? In thinking about this, I think it's useful to borrow a distinction from another discipline, the discipline of epidemiology. In 1985, Jeffrey Rose published a classic article called Sick Individuals and Sick Populations. Epidemiology and the study of criminality and deviance have several things in common. One is that they ask questions that can be posed at two levels. On the one hand, we can ask, why did that person have a heart attack? Or, why did that individual murder their partner? On the other hand, we can ask, why are rates of heart disease higher in this population than in that population? And the answer to these questions will be different because they're quite different questions. The first is a question about susceptibility or individual level etiology. The second is a question about incidence rates, which is a population matter. Populations that have a lot of the wrong sort of fat in their diet will have high rates of heart disease. Diet is an important part of explaining differences in the average level of heart disease incidence between populations. But within populations, it will explain rather little of the variation. If most people in a population eat little fat, then whatever variation there is in heart disease will be mostly unrelated to their diet and explainable, if explainable at all, by quite other factors. In a similar vein, the factors that explain the differences between populations in recorded violence may be quite different to those that account for susceptibility to violence within a given population. In a nutshell, explaining differences between averages and explaining variation around averages are quite different activities. And which of these sociologists of deviance are trying to explain is sometimes not entirely clear. In fact, sometimes it seems that sociologists of deviance are not actually interested in explaining the etiology of rule breaking at all, but rather in delineating how things unfold after some initial act of criminality has taken place. This very much captures the flavour of so-called labelling theory. The idea is, to use the words of Howard Becker taken from his classic monograph Outsiders, Deviance is not a quality of the act that the person commits, but rather a consequence of the application by others of rules and sanctions to the offender. The primary act of deviance, whatever it is taken as given, and its causes treated as essentially uninteresting, with the focus being on the so-called secondary deviance, which is the deviant's response to the labelling or identification of the initial deviant act by others, as indeed an act of deviance. This then raises questions like, well, who gets to apply the deviant label, to whom, and under what conditions can the label be made to stick? The criminal, or deviant, has a repertoire of responses they can try out. They may adapt or change their behaviour in the hope of becoming inconspicuous. They might become defensive, for example, claiming they didn't do it, or they're not the sort of person that others say they are, or they might go on the attack and say that their accusers are hypocrites and everyone does what they do, and their accusers are guilty of even worse. This line of thinking has gone down several routes. One is to talk about the role of deviance amplification by the media. Stan Cohen's work is a good example. This describes the process that turns an initial, usually criminal act, or a small number of acts, into an issue of widespread public concern. For example, concern about antisocial behaviour or muggings. Picked up by the media, these acts are framed as a particularly morally repugnant sign of the times, and the search is on for more cases to write about, possibly previously considered unnewsworthy or quite marginal to the focus of concern. Before long, events and activities with quite low rates of incidence can be made to look as though they are everyday occurrences, and as fuel is poured on the flames of the moral panic, politicians and others in positions of authority come under pressure to do something. Something must be done, so something is done, even if it is disproportionate or has no possible hope of dealing with the initial problem. Another line of development is to focus on the social psychology of the rule breaker themselves, and think about the strategies they use to manage their presentation of self to the outside world in their handling of potentially stigmatizing behaviors or personal characteristics. As you can imagine, in the hands of someone like Irving Goffman, the management of stigma provides a fertile field for the elaboration of yet another typology of the logical possibilities. These follow one of two paths: passing and revealing. Passing means putting on a more or less self-conscious performance to pass yourself off as what you are not. This might involve outright fabrication and deception, living a lie, or concealment, or discretion, leaving some things unsaid. Revealing can be handled in various ways. There might be more or less overt signalling in which the stigmatized characteristic is hinted at or just assumed to be common knowledge without drawing direct attention to it. There might be overt revealing followed by normalization, by treating whatever the stigma is as no big deal and, in fact, nothing to be concerned about. Or there might be differentiation, in which the stigmatized goes out of their way, in fact, to make a big deal about it, and emphasizes how their characteristics make them different, or perhaps even special to others. I've only scratched the surface of the sociology of crime and deviance. In closing, let me mention just a few of the things that I might have talked about in, as it were, an alternative lecture where I decided to take a quite different path through the material. Firstly, there's the issue of policing and how it's carried out. There is the occupational culture of the police service, the fact that being a police officer, rather like being a priest or a minister, is a rather special role that sets you off from the rest of society, but unlike perhaps being a priest or minister, generates a special esprit de corps, an intense sense of in-group solidarity, which is sometimes dysfunctional. Then there is the sociology of incarceration, the study of how prisons work, both formally and informally, how one becomes socialized into prison life, how one psychologically survives a long stretch, the rules of the prison game, the interaction between prisoners and prison officers, all might be explored here. The management and strategic use of reputation is another issue of interest. And then, what happens after release? Who reoffends and who doesn't? And is it really just old age that puts an end to most criminal careers? I've said nothing at all about the sources of our information about crime, the extent to which we can trust the official statistics or the information that's collected from victim surveys. What do these tell us about trends in violent and non-violent crime over time? And what, if anything, can be learnt about the drivers of these trends? Are they primarily demographic? For example, violent crime decreases when the birth rate decreases and the proportion of young men in the population eventually falls? Or are there factors in the natural environment that account for changes in crime levels? For example, the amount of lead in the air that we breathe. And what about purposive interventions in the physical environment? Can we, as was once thought, design crime out of our cities by paying more careful attention to the physical architecture of our public spaces? And if we can, do we actually want to do it? Is it a good idea, for example, to make urban spaces hostile for some groups, like rough sleepers, by designing out sheltered alcoves and building benches that can't be slept on? And finally, what about the long term? Everything I've talked about has been very much about the here and now, but how did we get here? In the past, as this graph suggests, life could, for many people, be nasty, brutish, and short. But over the centuries, the probability of, in the normal course of things, meeting a violent, homicidal end have declined really quite dramatically. How did we manage to civilize ourselves and bring to the fore, as Steven Pinker puts it, the better angels of our nature?